Howdy folks, this is the Comic Cowboy, and today I'm going to walk you through war comics, particularly the genre of books most known to collectors in the 1950s, as opposed to material in the Golden Age, such as this wonderful Schomburg cover here on Submariner. The area of comic collecting that is most associated with the genre of war incidentally is typically the 1950s. When people say horror, they're talking about pre-code typically with respect to Golden Age collecting, and war, they're usually pointing to the 1950s. War during the Golden Age of comics, from the birth of Superman in '38 to the end of the Second World War, and when those covers started to evaporate a bit, the newsstand, 44, 45, was really broad. And it really wasn't representational necessarily of a category, although there's plenty of war-focused Golden Age lines and books. When it comes across here in Blue Beetle or Submariner or Superman or any of the heroes of that era, typically it was a theme. When we got into the 1950s with what Atlas produced and other publishers, we see real focused, really cool efforts around war. Typically, although not always the case, focusing on which was the war of the time of that era, which was the Korean War, and the U.S. backed the UN forces during that conflict between North and South Korea, and a lot of the covers and the material really are related to that particular war effort, not necessarily the Second World War. So interestingly, when I first got into collecting of the war books in the 1950s and I started reading the material, I thought it would be about the Second World War. For the most part, here's some depictions of the Chinese who got together with the North Koreans during the conflict. It's usually the US forces against the enemy, which was the North Korean forces, or in some cases the Chinese. And it's a dramatic retelling of some of the themes that happened at that time. Not necessarily what characterized that war from the U.S. perspective, which was a massive aerial campaign. There's not a lot of that material here in the books. They're more grounded in conflict that happened on the ground, or in some cases, a dramatization of themes that happened during that era, most particular with what EC did in some of the commentary and some of the work they did around storytelling in the war was fantastic. So the first thing I'll say, it's a really fun category to participate in because it's a bit off the radar in relation to other genre material of the era, of the 1950s. When you're counting science fiction, pretty big category. Pre-code horror, massive, large category. In another video that I've already produced, I've gone on at length about how to kind of attack that category and some of the examples that I've got in my collection. Superheroes, Western, all these are subgenres and fun categories to participate in the 1950s. And war, in particular, offers a lot because it's a real fun, exciting, dynamic category with a lot of enthusiastic collectors. There's a lot of material out there to get. Some of it is hard to acquire, but it's all, at this moment in time, relatively inexpensive to purchase, relatively easy to acquire, whether you find it at auction or through a dealer or on eBay. I'm going to point out to you some things to look for when you purchase this material, and also just a kind of a nice leisurely stroll through my collection. You'll find in the videos I produce, I'm always going to be showing you the books. I'm not talking theoretically about concepts of collecting or opining on books I don't have. So a lot of it really, frankly, is just a love of the books and a showcase of some stuff I have, and a chance for fans and enthusiasts to see the books and maybe get some ideas or some things that you'd like to acquire for your collection that you didn't know were out there, or just connecting with another collector who's as enthusiastic as you are about the collecting. I actually have here, I like reading comic books, and I read both the material from the 1950s, I read some of the Golden Age stuff, and also read, in a lot of cases, contemporary books. So if you like war, here's a plug for Uber. Here's issue 1. This is sort of a concept of what would happen in the Second World War if the Nazis had superpowered heroes and villains fighting against the Allies. So it's a really interesting line. So if you like war, these books are really awesome to obtain because they make for a very good read. Just like the horror books of the 1950s do, they're interesting books to read, and I think the level of storytelling and the quality in the writers in this material was a higher bar than what you'll find in this Submariner book, which isn't necessarily talking about what happened in the Second World War. It's more what if scenarios should the superheroes been involved in that particular conflict, which is interesting ground, but it's not necessarily the richest reading that I've ever come across. I do better with the modern stuff. I do better with the stuff in the 1950s. So when you get into collecting war books here, I like to focus on Atlas. I think it's the best publisher of this material by far, and they had a lot of lines, whether it's war action, whether it's war. Here we've got battle, and there's both pre-code material and code material. So, you know, as we got into the later 1950s, of course, the comic book code started screening some of the material both within the content of the pages and the covers itself. But that is mostly known as a concept in the horror space, where there's the pre-code and everything that came after it, which is a little bit more dramatic in terms of the difference between the covers you saw of ants crawling out of the mouth, heads being pushed into vats of acid, and the material that came afterwards in the comic book code era of the late mid-1950s. You saw stuff that was a little bit geared more towards the supernatural, as they got away from, you know, heads in tufts of hair holding decapitated heads over potholes and things like that. In war, and I make this point with war books, there isn't too much of a difference between covers with the comic book code in the Battleground line, which started pre-code, and material that was, of course, earlier in the era here, which is a great Men in Action line. In terms of what to collect and how to think about this category from, I would say, a collecting perspective, there's a couple things that I noticed when I participated in war that I found helpful. Because it's a category that's a little bit vast. It's hard to get crisp data on what the material is worth. So, for example, let's say you wanted to buy a copy of War here, which is issue number 16, and you see it on Comic Connect for sale, or you see it on Heritage, or you see it on eBay in various conditions at various different price points. When I first started getting into war, I had a little bit of a difficult time discerning what the stuff was worth and what was a good price to pay, other than seemed sort of cheap, seemed like a good price to pick up at $40, $50, why not? So if you go to GPA analysis and you look at the data of how this stuff has sold, that's a little bit of a misnomer, because a lot of this inexpensive material, for the most part, doesn't live in the slabbed state, right? So when you get to the Submariner line with Atlas, these Sham covers, you can get a pretty good read on what the book's selling for in 4.5 or 6.5 or 7.0, because there's a lot of evidence of sales that's been recorded for you to make a call on what a good price to pay is on this book. Not so much with the war stuff. You know, with horror, a lot of that material from collectors started getting really valuable and appreciating pretty quickly. So the stuff got slabbed, recorded, sold at auction, lots of price points. With this stuff, it's harder to tell, really. So a couple things that I followed in terms of how to pursue this material was, one, condition. Like pre-code horror and like comic books from the 1950s, material in mid or higher grade is really scarce. It's hard to come by. So if you see a copy of Battleground here, which is probably in very good condition here, looks like I paid $13 for this particular book. It's a great cover, and you could probably find this book again for, you know, $10, $15, $20 in a long box somewhere at a show, or maybe on eBay or on the CGC boards from time to time. This stuff does appear. This book in higher grade, if you come across it, and we're talking about the grade that you perceive it to be, because it's not going to be slabbed. People are not slabbing coated Battleground books for the most part, unless someone's getting toasted by a flamethrower. Those niche inside of war tend to sometimes end up in a CGC holder. You may be looking at the highest graded example of the book, and that's a great way to curate your collection of war and really put together an impressive collection of what is really a category that has a tremendous amount of room to grow and appreciate. Unlike horror, which is really at the top of the market, or unlike science fiction, which has sort of found its place in the spectrum of different price points of where to participate in genre material from the 1950s, war is really a smaller genre, and it's a smaller niche, and I think it has a tremendous amount of appeal. A lot of the artists that were working on this material, whether that's Heath or Heck or others, were also making covers, sort of iconic covers in the horror genre. And so, for example, you know, this is a Matt Baker cover. His stuff in the 1940s and to some extent in the 1950s is quite sought after and can be rather expensive. His covers that he did in the war genre, and also in Western, where Baker did a number of covers, is really inexpensive to get work from really one of the finest masters in the comic book genre, one of the best artists we've ever seen. So his material is particularly great. Here, it's a little hard to tell what conflict he was depicting here. It's not as overt as what was happening in the Atlas line, which was really pointing towards the Korean War for the most part. And, you know, if you like war, there's a lot of places to go. You could really go niche, and you could just collect battle, and you could focus on the Atlas war line, which is tremendous, super gratifying, and I think some of the covers that you find in the Atlas books are among the best, if not the best, of the era in this genre. And this material really holds its own against any book that was produced in the 1950s in terms of the quality of the artwork, the compositions, the various elements that come together in this really dramatic, fascinating cover, and just the integrity of the writing was really high. So I open up these books and I enjoy them and I read them, and it really deepens my appreciation for this category. And then you can also go to something like wartime romances. And here's a book that really is at the crosshairs of folks that collect war books might pick this up. Folks that like romance are interested and attracted to this line, and also enthusiasts for Baker. These are absolutely fantastic. You will see them come to auction, the Wartime Romances line. They're very sought after. They're hard to find. There's not a lot of examples out there. And this is in lower grade, which is really sort of a prevalent condition you find with these books. You will see them in mid to higher grade, and if you can, snatch them up. They won't last. And some of the covers in the Wartime Romances line are fantastic. They tend to be, as opposed to what we see over here with Atlas, which is really an action portrait, more character studies, a little bit more narrative. It's got a story happening here, which is really interesting. These are great books, and I just sort of collect them together with war, although people often don't do that. The last thing I'll point out around this category is there's a couple things on the cover that typically may make the book a little bit more sought after and coveted, and it's pretty simple. If there's a flamethrower and if dudes are getting toasted, and the more dramatic that is, that can tend to escalate the price and value of the book. The flamethrower is found in a lot of these books, and sometimes it's very overt, such as this. And then there's just a couple examples where the carnage is particularly dramatic and direct, and that material is actually quite sought after, very valuable. So when you think about this category and you want to participate in it, as I've mentioned before, a good place to start, so you're not bewildered by all the choices that are out there, is with the Gerber Guide. The Gerber Guide, volumes 1 and 2, have all this material in the pages of their book, and it has each example across the whole line. So if you want to do battle, you want to do war action or war or whatever the line could be, you could look at every single cover, and you can find covers that you like. And also for folks that enjoy collecting lines, I just did a recent video on collecting Silver Age high-end X-Men. War is a great place to start and assemble material in a particular line. Last but not least, if you can and you're interested in seeing more of this content, please do subscribe. I intend to do more videos, which is really for the love of it, for the joy of collecting. I'm not a dealer. Without subscribers, it's really hard for me to rationalize continuing to do this because it takes a bit of time and effort to find the books out of the collection, put them here together, and freeform into talking about what it is they represent. So I hope you enjoyed this. Have a good one.